Okay, we're going to start this hearing in 3 minutes. I'm setting the clock. So, Sergeant, please call the absent members, and we're going to get started in 3 minutes.
Sacramento County Board of Supervisors and my Board of Supervisors and all the people that should be here.
Okay. So she didn't feel so guilty about starting without that.
They're on the board checking you. We can do it first.
So they've already given their testimony. Yeah. Yes, very true. Is the Senate really charging ahead?
Rich Gordon's the chair. He's
Oh, it's all right. I've already eaten.
Oh, good for you. We're going to be having the opioid disease.
You hear my voice?
We're hearing somebody's.
Did you have a good weekend? Very good.
Good afternoon. Today's hearing is about one of the boldest ideas for government proposed in years, Governor Brown's proposal for realignment. Realignment is basically a wonkish word for restructuring government. The concept is that the state should shift the provision of certain services to counties because they have a better track record of success, efficiency, and innovation in the state. Before we begin, I want to thank my colleagues who have led 30 hearings in 3 weeks on all aspects of the budget. Your hard work to tee up our final Budget Committee hearings this Friday, leading into the Conference Committee process, really deserves recognition. As we proceed toward a comprehensive budget agreement, the subject before us today will define our success in putting California back on track. We held a very similar hearing on realignment in L.A. County at the L.A. County Board of Supervisors in their chambers 10 days ago, where the supervisors expressed a range of concerns rooted in the fallout from the 1991 realignment and a desire for more specifics about how it would work at this time. I look forward to continuing the discussion on the issue and to continuing the discussion with our L.A. supervisors. Realignment offers the chance of a generation to bring true change to the state that we all love. We can transform our government, ensuring that the result is why we are here today. Today's hearing is the second gathering of the Assembly Budget Subcommittee on Budget Process Oversight and Program Evaluation. We created this subcommittee to make budget decisions more informed by program results and outcomes, and with a membership composed of only legislators with leadership roles on state spending, including all of the sub-chairs of the Budget Committee, the group is well positioned to identify budget solutions through discussing the tough but necessary issues of the day. I want to revisit some of the comments I made in Los Angeles again to help frame this debate. From the perspective of dollars and cents, the governor's restructuring proposal focuses on public safety, where the difference in performance between the state and the counties really inspires more attention. California has a gigantic, expensive state correction system that has failed on many levels. For all that we spend, we should get more in return. Prisons operate under a court-ordered appointed federal receiver because they fail to provide adequate health care to prisoners. They also have a recidivism rate of over 60%. We can do better than that. Redirecting parole programs to counties, for example, offers a chance to reward innovation. Community-based programs are often cheaper, more effective, and they can deal with low-level offenders. Tough law and order states like Texas and Arizona have found ways to improve public safety and reduce costs at the same time. These states used evidence-based probation practices to deal with low-level offenders. And when funded successfully, these programs have worked to keep offenders from becoming career criminals. The result is less crime and lower criminal justice costs. This isn't just a theoretical model. This is an ivory tower model. It's something that's actually happening on the ground in other states. It's working in various places across the country. We have a choice to make. We stay the course with less than acceptable results, or we move toward trying to get safer streets, fewer repeat offenders, more productive citizens, and reduced gang activity. We can do all that for less money if we restructure public safety properly. There's a lot of ifs and conditionals in there, but we can get there. That's the good news. Now for the reality check. The relationship between the counties and the state has been pretty rocky since the passage of Proposition 13. The state and counties have often been pitted against each other. And rather than acting as partners working toward the same goal as we should be, after all, we share the same boss, the people, the public. The people expect us to work together to resolve our differences for the greater good. And we need to create true partnership of equals, which makes me think about marriage as a metaphor for how we should proceed with restructuring. Like a marriage, the state and counties must support each other in good times, in bad times, in sickness, and in health. But we cannot have a shotgun wedding. The governor has asked the legislature to approve his realignment proposals by March so that they may be put forward by the voters on a special election ballot this June. This is an ambitious goal and an ambitious starting point. But it's also a monumental challenge because these programs cannot be unintentionally set up to fail. Restructuring government can work. It has great potential, but it must be driven by a partnership of equal, willing partners. If it isn't, the state-county marriage will not likely be blessed by the voters come June. And the implications of that outcome, a $25 billion cuts-only budget, is simply unacceptable. Today's hearings must sow the seeds of change in our journey to restructure California. Our success will ensure that the people buy into the concept as a credible solution worthy of support at the ballot box. We cannot lose this opportunity because our actions were rushed, our layers of government divided, and we did not take the time to actually involve the stakeholders in what restructuring looks like and how it works. As some of you know, I'm working on a way to implement the governor's proposal for restructuring California that provides a framework to navigate the uncertainty and the risk, and to build a partnership between the state and counties in this great time of need, and also to give voters the confidence that this isn't just another gimmick, or worse, a mistake. But the purpose of this hearing is not to look at other ways of implementing the proposal. The point of today is to really vet the proposal and get it out there and hear from the governor and hear from other stakeholders and the legislative analysts to really vet the proposal in its entirety. So with that, I'd like to, before I call up the witnesses, I want to ask our vice chair if he has any additional comments to add.
No, Mr. Chairman, let's just proceed.
Okay. So with that, I'd like to call up our first two witnesses, Diane Cummings and Marianne O'Malley from the Department of Finance and LAO, respectively. So Ms. Cummings, please begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the committee, I'm Diane Cummins from the Department of Finance. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the governor's realignment proposal here today. A little hard to follow some of your comments. You were so eloquent in stating some of the needs that we have in California. So before discussing specifics of the proposal, I would just say again that the idea of realignment is not new. Realignment is defined really as the transfer of programs and funding to and or from one level of government to another, generally in California between the state and counties, because the counties serve as the state service provider in so many of our programs. One of the first realignments was put into statute as part of the 1978 to 1979 so-called bailout of local government after Prop 13, as the state assumed costs previously borne by counties in Medi-Cal and SSI, SSP, as well as other programs. We talk a lot about Realignment 1, which occurred in 1991-92 as a $2.2 billion budget solution that year. But the state's assumption of trial court costs in 1997 and the most recent shifts of the large majority of juvenile offenders and money from DJJ to the counties are also examples of realignment. These past examples informed the governor's decision as he approached his budget decisions around the following framework. Government should focus on core services. We should assign program and fiscal responsibility to the level of government that can best provide the service, with an emphasis that government should be moved closer to the people, where local decision makers can tailor programs to meet their community needs. We should provide dedicated revenue to fund the services that are realigned. We should provide as much flexibility as possible to the level of government providing the services, which hopefully increases the integration of services, leading to better outcomes and more efficient use of resources. We should reduce duplication and minimize overhead costs, and we should focus the state's role on appropriate oversight, technical assistance, and monitoring of program outcomes. The governor is proposing two phases of realignment. Phase 1 is a $5.9 billion transfer of programs to counties with revenue equal to the program transfer. Phase 1, as you indicated, should be considered in broad terms as a public safety realignment. Public safety is a core function of local government. However, it goes beyond patrol and jail duties. We would define public safety as a community effort which involves the safety of children who are in the child welfare system, the safety of adults who are in the adult protective system, as well as supportive services such as substance abuse and mental health services. In 1997, when the state assumed the costs for trial courts in this state, the state felt that it had the two high-end programs in terms of costs of the criminal justice system, prisons and courts. The state should focus on the most violent, most serious felonies, and the next logical step was to rebuild a community corrections system focused not only on appropriate incarceration, but with treatment and services that would help stop the revolving door of corrections. This proposal incorporates that next step. The proposal includes the following components. There is a fire and emergency response component associated with CAL FIRE. As you know, the composition of SRAs has changed significantly over the years, with many more structures in the urban interface, which has changed the nature and costs for CAL FIRE, which also responds to over 60,000 medical emergencies in SRAs. This proposal would require the Board of Forestry to revise the criteria and definitions of SRAs to ensure that those who are making development decisions are appropriately providing the services. Court security is a component which in 56 counties is provided by the county sheriff, would not affect the two counties that are marshal counties. Public safety programs such as COPS, juvenile justice, booking fee reimbursement, and small and rural sheriff programs are also part of the realignment. And one of the major portions is the local jurisdiction for lower-level offenders, parole violators, adult parole, and the remaining juvenile offenders from DJJ, the transfer of those 4 components of programs to the counties. And the rationale for this is really, the number of lower-level offenders has increased dramatically in this state, and on any given day may represent almost half the prison population. Parole violators tend to return to prison for short 2 to 4 month stays. We believe that these 2 categories of offenders should become the responsibility of local jurisdictions, where we believe with the resources they can be better managed through a combination of jail time and services through probation. The remaining juvenile offenders, we have less than 1,300. We are paying $200,000 per ward per year. We think, again, the probation departments at the local level have served the youth that have been transferred there very well, and we think the remaining youth in DJJ can be transferred. And see, parole violator, adult parole as well. The parole system, as you know, often returns 65,000 to 80,000 parolees per year. Parole violators, so those 4 categories, parole violators, low-level offenders, parolees, and juvenile offenders, each come with a dollar amount based on assumptions of jail time at the local level and service needs. So we believe that, along with having substance abuse and mental health at the local level, should give counties an opportunity to integrate services better, including services for those who are duly diagnosed. Then mental health services, the remainder of the mental health services that are general fund in the state. These are EPSDT services for children, AB 3632, which is mental health services for severely emotionally disturbed children, and the remaining general fund in mental health managed care. Substance abuse treatment services, adult protective services, and the remaining state share of the Child Welfare Services foster care program. So all of those programs together equal the $5.9 billion. One of the things that is of particular interest this time, and the chair mentioned some of the mistakes that we may have made in 1991 in terms of realignment. And one of the things that we did not do in 1991 is clarify the role of the state after realignment. I think you've heard many complaints from your counties about the role of the Department of Mental Health, and even if we just did not take a look at that. And I think this time the governor has said that he would target a 25% reduction in state operations in the realigned programs, knowing that the state has to maintain certain responsibilities, such as we are the single state agency for dealing with the federal government. The state probably should retain rate-setting authority, though some have suggested that individual counties should develop their own rate structure. The state should do licensing and certification because there's a broader public safety, public good issue there. But that's the subject of discussion. What is the role of the state? And I think this time we need to be sure and clarify what that is so that there's not this blurred line of responsibility over program administration. The programs that the governor is proposing to realign will be funded in his proposal through the extension of the 0.5% vehicle license fee and the 1 cent sales tax, with the exception in year 1, EPSDT, AB 3632, and the mental health managed care would be funded through a redirection of the Prop 63 funds. We would also note that because CAL FIRE and the corrections proposals are phased in, it would be our intent that the state is reimbursed for its costs in the initial couple years of the proposal. As you indicated, the governor is proposing that a constitutional amendment be approved by the legislature by March to be placed on a June ballot. The portion of the constitutional amendment dealing with realignment would include the following: the programs identified for realignment, identify them as local, clearly as local programs, and it would contain the underlying funding mechanism, that is the extension of the two tax rates. It would also indicate that there's an ongoing obligation of funding in an amount equivalent to these two fund sources after the 5 years. The governor is asking for a 5-year extension of the taxes. This would be an ongoing obligation of funding to the counties. So that would have to be in the constitutional amendment. You mentioned the specifics, all of the details that would go along with this, and there are many of them. We did not come out with specific proposals. I think I indicated before, if we had, we would have certainly been wrong and left things out, or not talked about all the things that needed to be talked about from a county perspective. But things like flexibility, the state role, how do you meet statewide-ness, are there appropriate cost control measures that need to be taken into account? We just could not have done that in the short time that we had, and don't believe that they can be done by March. We do believe that the legislature, working with the administration, the counties, and interested parties, can follow up and do that work by June. The thing that is key to the March ballot issue is identifying the programs that would be realigned, so that people have an understanding of what's being transferred to local government. I mentioned that this is realignment is done in 2 phases. I'll just briefly mention phase 2. It is not a budget issue before you this year, and it is intertwined with health care reform. Given the number of indigent population who are going to be on Medi-Cal, the thought is that the state should assume a significant portion of the health care costs currently now administered by the counties, including in-home supportive services and California Children's Services. In exchange, counties would take on the full costs of CalWORKS, food stamp administration, child support, and child care. We have listened to the legislative comments in various hearings, the subcommittee hearings, meetings with the counties, program experts, advocacy organizations, affiliate organizations, and continue to review suggestions and concerns. We take the concerns, particularly the public safety concerns that have been raised, seriously. We are internally reviewing them. We have been pleased that despite the concerns identified, counties in particular have been willing to seriously discuss how realignment might work, and we continue to believe that the framework we have is an appropriate one for realignment. While we are mindful of the risk, we believe the system we have is overly expensive, duplicative, and needs to move toward a better integrated, more community-focused system. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you. I think before we get to questions, we'll have our second presentation from Ms. O'Malley, and then we'll ask questions of the two of you. Ms. O'Malley, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, members. Mary Ann O'Malley with the Legislative Analyst Office. Ms. Cummins did a very good job in explaining the conceptual concept of realignment along with the administration's proposal. So I think what I'll do is I'm speaking from this handout, an overview of the governor's realignment proposal, but we could probably skip then on over to about page 3 and talk about what is the governor proposing to realign. Using the word realign the kind of the unique way that we do this in this building. Realignment, probably if you were to go on Wikipedia, you'd never find a discussion of realignment, kind of what we're talking about here in California. They probably are talking more about cars or what you do when you add more sports teams, you know, in a division and you need to move things around a little bit. But here in California, we've tended to talk about realignment as being these purposeful shifts of governmental responsibilities, which we've done throughout time. Our program responsibilities have never been static. Once upon a time, School districts were mostly a local program and locally financed, but over time we've shifted that, and school districts are much more of a shared obligation today. If you go back in the 1930s, many programs to aid the indigent was primarily a county responsibility. But then with the advent of a variety of federal programs, we ended up with a lot of programs to aid the indigent that are both federal, state, and county programs. And so what we're talking about now is another one of these moments in history when we're thinking about whether it's a good idea to make a purposeful change in state-county responsibilities. In terms of what the administration is proposing to realign, it's almost $6 billion of, as we show on page 3, criminal justice, mental health, child welfare services. And just to put the scale of this in perspective, in contrast with the 1991 realignment plan, this one's significantly larger. In current dollars, it's over $2 billion larger than the 1991 realignment. So what we're talking about is a very, very significant change in who does what in California. And of course, this realignment would be contingent upon the voters approving the extension of the temporary tax increases. If you turn to the next page, the LAO's overall assessment of the proposal, we find a lot of merit to what the administration is proposing. And in fact, many of the components of the proposal, we've looked at them and went, oh, the LAO recommended that a few years ago. So for many of these individual elements of the proposal, we're in general support with the administration's approach. And we do think that in case of a variety of these programs, it could result in better service delivery, more accountability, more responsiveness to the at the local level, and could yield to overall improvements in governmental program delivery. As we indicate on the bottom of page 4, though, there's a lot of work to be done to move from the concept of realignment all the way to an implemented plan. There's a lot of tough decisions about whether or not you, the legislature, are comfortable providing local authority over these programs. You don't have a lot of time, and of course the entire plan is contingent upon the voters saying okay. So turning to the next page, step 1. The governor has given you a generally good list. I'll give you our assessment of the individual programs, but generally a good starting point. A good list of programs to consider for realignment. But your first step is figuring out, are these programs that are in the legislature's interest and desire to realign? Are these the ones that the legislature would be comfortable giving counties greater authority, greater autonomy over? In terms of the next bullet, we give some thinking points as to what are programs that are best shifted to locals. They're programs where you, the legislature, do not believe that statewide uniformity is critical. If it is a program that you think administrative uniformity, funding uniformity is critical, it's probably not a best program to realign to the county level because they won't be able to administer it in a very different way. The programs that are better administered at the local level are those where you want innovation, you want experimentation, you want flexibility, and you want greater service integration. You want to be able to give county authority to administer 3 very related programs, maybe under the same roof, delivering programs to the same family and do it in an integrated fashion. Those are the kind of programs that are probably best to include in your realignment plan. On page 6, we have a figure that summarizes the LAO's initial assessment of the programs selected for realignment. And what we did is we took the governor's list of programs and the dollar amounts that were identified by the administration, but sorted them into 3 different categories. The first group are programs that, in our view, are suited for realignment. And the largest single dollar number there is the local jurisdiction for lower level offenders and parole violators. We do believe that realigning that to counties, giving them greater control, greater responsibility for substance abuse program and providing mental health services to these individuals could result in better outcomes. And so we included that program in the first group of programs suited for realignment. We've also included AB 3632 services, although in that case, we would recommend that it be realigned to schools and not to counties. These are mental health services provided to special education pupils In every other state in the United States, this is a school responsibility, and we think it would make more sense to realign, but to realign to schools. The second group of programs are a variety of mental health programs and substance abuse programs. And under any other times, our office would have fully recommended that they be realigned to counties. Counties already administer a wide variety of mental health services, and this would be giving them the remaining programs and along with the funding. We do want the legislature to contemplate, though, the effect of federal health care reform on the delivery of these programs. In many cases, some of the services that are included in these programs would be, after 2014, included as a Medi-Cal service. And so you need to sort out whether or not this kind of program realignment makes the most sense given your vision in terms of federal health care reform. And then the third is just one program, court security, which we've listed as a program, in our view, not suited for realignment. And the reason for this is the courts are now a state-supported program. The buildings are now state buildings. It makes no sense to our mind, then, for the security for those employees who are getting a check derived from the state and the buildings that are state facilities to be given security services through by funding provided directly to the county. If you turn to the next page on 7, there are some key program design issues. The first is to roughly match the revenues and expenditures. And you don't have to look at every single revenue and every single program, but we'd recommend that you take a look at the portfolio of programs that you're realigning to the counties and make sure that over time the portfolio of revenues roughly matches the portfolio of program responsibilities. The second is that we'd recommend that if the counties are going to have responsibility for the program, they should have as much decision-making authority over the program as possible. The third is a very difficult issue in terms of allocating the revenues to counties and to programs. And you're probably going to hear from a variety of program advocates that say, well, if you're going to do realignment, the funds for program X should be completely separated from the funds for program B, because we want to make sure that at the county level they're going to preserve the funding for these critically important programs. What you may hear, though, from the county administrator's standpoint, though, is don't put all these funds into different pots. If you want us to administer the program in a flexible way, if you want to have innovation and experimentation, give us some authority to be able to use these funds flexibly. So you're likely to hear some different opinions on that one. And then the next one is get the fiscal incentives right. You want to make sure that the counties bear the cost of program failures and also enjoy the outcomes of program successes. You don't want to have a system whereby where cost of program failures are shifted to the state or the counties don't enjoy the benefits of program success. Then on page 8, we outline some of the options that the legislature has in shaping a realignment proposal. First, you get to choose which programs you want to include. And you want to realign the programs that make sense. Start with what is the best way to administer the program and taking a look at the program design, not focusing necessarily on a dollar target of programs that you'd wish to realign. There's a variety of financing options. The administration has proposed a 1-cent sales tax and also a slight increase in the vehicle license fee or extension of those revenues. The legislature has other alternatives. You don't have to implement realignment using those revenue sources. And there's also many program design options that are available to the legislature. And then in terms of final words of caution, as with any complex legislation, the details really matter. You're also going to need to be able to achieve some general consensus with counties regarding the nature of these programs to be realigned and how these programs are to be administered. And then my final word of caution is that once you enact the realignment plan, It is very, very difficult to make changes in the future. In part, that's because of various constitutional restrictions and in terms of the constitutional requirement of reimbursing counties for new programs or new mandated requirements. So it'll be very important to get the key elements of realignment right, because it will be very difficult to modify it down the road. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. O'Malley. I'll start with a question, then just to remind members, just shoot me a glance. If you want a question, I'll put you on the list. One finger for just a regular question. If you have a follow-up, just shoot me two fingers. We're a smaller group, so we can navigate a little better that way, and we'll go through the order multiple times. So we'll be keeping a list and going through it. But I'll start with a question from Ms. Cummins. Based on the L.A. hearing that we had, the biggest thing that I heard from our county supervisors was basically they're concerned about the risk, and we've talked about this and the risk in terms of what happens after 5 years, but also the risk in terms of, let's say the programs cost more than the $5.9 billion. So O'Malley was saying that we should take a look at it as a block of funding. Some of the county folks are looking at it on an individual basis. Well, if this program goes this high and we're not prepared for that. And some have gone so far as to suggest that we indemnify them from all risk, which obviously is the extreme. But the other extreme is we just provide them a lump sum based on either a lump sum or based on a revenue stream that may or may not have any relationship to the actual costs of the program. So how do we go about navigating a fair sharing of the risk involved in the inevitable discrepancy between the amount of money that we have and the costs of these programs?
Well, my answer about what happens after 5 years is that the governor is committed to the ongoing nature of revenue going to local government for the realigned programs. So that's a given. The risk between, from the time you realign to over the years, and do you have enough revenue to operate the program, it could be a very lengthy discussion. People have complained that the two revenue sources in 1991 did not keep up with the program costs. There's some reasons for that in 1991. There's some reasons for that I think it would be good for us to think about as we do this. I don't think you're ever going to match dollar for dollar the programs you realign with the revenue. And I think this is about change and changing the way you do business. And hopefully that with a more integrated, more outcome-based program at the local level, you would perhaps not grow your costs as much as the state. And take parole and parole violators as a good example. There, I know we've heard a lot about jail capacity and the cost of incarceration. I don't think that's the only part of this program. I don't think we're expecting that you exchange prison days for jail days, that there are other options at the local level, including services to be provided, intermediate sanctions, GPS, things that would change the cost of running the program. So it's a little bit hard on an overall basis to look at it until you decide which programs that you can actually change the way you're running the program to see if you can lower the costs. So some programs may go up because they're entitlement programs. On the other hand, some of the costs that you realign may go down over time because you're changing the way you're doing business. So when you get the mix of the programs, you can take a better look at that. We think over the 5 years that by the year 2014-15, there's over $600 million worth of growth in the revenue that's forecast. We think that, we outlined that in our budget summary, we think that should cover the increased cost of these programs over the same period of time.
Okay. Ms. O'Malley, do you have additional comment on that?
In terms of thinking about the revenue, there's kind of four things that usually come to my mind when I hear this discussion. The first is you'll want to make sure that the tax source or the revenue base is one that generally grows over time in some kind of relationship, perhaps with the economy or population. So you want to start off with what's the revenue base. The other thing is you want to take a look about whether or not you're giving counties enough flexibility so that in time to time when a program costs are growing, that they can take some kind of action to bring the program cost down, achieving economies and efficiencies. The next thing you need to think about is whether or not the county is going to be bearing the downstream cost associated with future legislative changes or federal changes. Because you may align the perfect program with the perfect revenue stream, but if the legislature augments that program responsibility down the road, or if by federal court action the program scope is changed, that can also send things a bit out of whack. And then the very last thing I bring up is that the notion of funding pot flexibility. If you're going to have each program funding in a different segregated pot, it's going to be much harder to be able to say that each one of those pots is perfectly sufficient. So it does argue also for providing some kind of like a single pot or some perhaps just two pots. It makes it a little bit easier from an administrative standpoint to be able to have a sufficient amount of revenues to finance all the programs.
I have a number of questions, but I'm going to cycle myself through the list. And next, I'll defer to the Vice Chair.
It's instructive to me that the purported beneficiaries of these changes in realignment are not packing the room, beside themselves with glee at the great boon that will be descending upon them. And I don't mean that facetiously. I mean that really. This is a long and storied history of realignment. And seldom has the state ever kept its good faith to the counties, to a lesser degree the cities. And as I've watched it over the years, I've seen that great skepticism. And I think that's why you don't see a lot of local government here, people saying, please give me your teeming masses, we will take them. Ms. O'Malley made a good point just lastly, that what about the future obligations that would be imposed pursuant to successive statutory changes and or court decisions? Do we possibly think some of these now locally incarcerated inmates are not going to be required by some federal court to receive the same kind of care state inmates are now at the cost of billions of dollars? But the real problem with this is the lack of specificity. In such a short time, something of such great moment, and such great consequence to the citizens of California, I just dare say we cannot but go there in very limited ways. And as a part of this budget resolution, I would argue that maybe in part that's something we should focus on, scaling this drastically back down, particularly in light of the disparity. We really don't know what we're considering or voting for. And I have the highest respect for Diane Cummings over the years, such a true professional. And I'm not being critical of you. I'm being very concerned about the program. This discussion has got to start with mandates. Where has that discussion been about mandates? What will be required of counties in conducting these programs? If they have the discretion, at least you can talk to me a little bit about it and maybe convince me. If they don't have the discretion, including the discretion to say no, I see nowhere to even begin. If the local sheriff cannot say, do not give me your inmates, I don't see where we can even have a discussion. When will we hear what will be the plan for us mandates on local government concerned pursuant to these realigned programs?
We had proposed that by the March ballot, we would have agreement on the programs, but not the specificity that you talk about. If people agreed that these programs were viable ones for realignment, then we would have to work out all of those kinds of details. And in fact, we have heard a number of issues from the counties, from local law enforcement that we have been talking about internally. But we do not have specific answers for you.
And that's one of the fundamental and fatal flaws in what we're considering here. And without that greater specificity, I would just be so very concerned. The juvenile offenders, we sort of make light, but the only juvenile offenders left in the state jurisdiction are the worst of the worst. Another aspect of this whole realignment depends on what local resources are available to serve these populations, plural. And in that they have not had those resources for decades is one of the reasons that more has been done at the state level. And I'm very skeptical about that. What I'm getting is that there's no way we're really going to know by the time this legislature votes the consequences of what we're voting on. That seemed to be impossible to me in terms of the timeline, but even the representations, Ms. Cummings, you've just given us, there's no way we're going to know. This is just huge, isn't it?
These are very significant changes. I would not underestimate the magnitude of them. But I do believe that we have some examples of dealing with counties in these programs that point to their success. The probation departments have had great success with the juvenile offenders they've taken already out of DJJ. Yes, these may be the worst of the worst, but that doesn't mean that some of them can't benefit from being in the community and having community programs available for them. This year, county's probation is implementing SB 678 regarding felony probation. They're having success with it. So I do think that there are, outside of the public safety area, and it's not to say that they don't deal with those populations, they do every day, but in the health and human services world, they already operate these programs. So I do think we have a track record of success in the counties in dealing with these programs. And each individual program is going to have different issues and need different discussions and resolutions and cost containment measures. And that's part of why we wanted to do that with the counties, with the legislature, and not dictate what that is.
Okay, I think I've asked enough for now. I don't want to belabor it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Ms. Harkey, followed by Mr. Chesborough, followed by Ms. Buchanan.
Thank you. This is for Department of Finance. Did I hear you say that we were going to put this on the ballot, the actual suggestions for realigning?
The governor has asked that in the constitutional amendment, we define the programs that would be realigned, define them as local, and have the funding mechanism for them in the constitutional amendment.
Okay, I just want to state for the record, I could understand why the governor wants to put a tax increase down the people to decide. That kind of gets everybody out of the firing line. What I don't understand is how you're going to expect the people to decide, make our decisions as to what programs need to go where and how, especially with the lack of detail. So I want to go on the record as saying that. I think this is shirking the legislature's responsibility to put things, big, loaded questions like this on the ballot for the people of California to vote for. That's what we're here for. The second thing I wanted to ask, is there a... I'm very concerned about local authority versus local mandate, and so I think that Mr. Nielsen has covered that quite well. But are stakeholders involved at this point? Is somebody starting to design these programs that we're thinking of rolling out?
What our process has been is first getting our departments to articulate for us what the federal requirements are, because in some of these programs we know there are significant federal requirements, and then identify the areas of state law that may, or state regulation that may exceed those federal requirements. And that's really the first step that we have to take internally. And when we have that discussion internally, we have to go back to the governor and have that discussion.
Okay, the next question could be for the LAO, could be for yourself as well. The dollars be saved, supposedly, the reason that we're doing this is because we're broke and we really can't pay for it. We need to find $5-6 billion. So that being said, we're going to put these responsibilities onto the locals, along with supplying an extra tax funding source. What reductions are we making immediately upon doing so at the state level to personnel or in departments?
I indicated that the governor has committed to at least a 25% reduction in state operations in all those program areas where there's realigned programs. Could be some more in some areas, a little bit less in others, but we're having the departments go through right now based on what they think their remaining state requirements would be, and go through the detail of state operations to try and reach a 25% reduction.
Okay, my final question for the LAO. You said choose among various financing options, select revenue source, and its operative time period. We have the governor's solution, which is the tax increase for 5 years. What are our other revenue sources that you might suggest?
The administration has the $5.9 billion that they're proposing to dedicate for realignment. But if you look at the administration's budget proposal, there are a variety of other taxes that they're also proposing to extend or other ways of raising revenues. And they're proposing to put those in the general fund and use those for general funded programs. There's nothing magical about the 1-cent sales tax or the vehicle license fee increase. So, for example, the revenues raised through the dependent care, the dependent benefit change, those funds could be used for realignment. There's nothing magical about the 1-cent sales tax. You could look at any other revenue source that the governor proposes to extend, or even a designated portion of the state's general fund. You could separate out and say, this is our realignment revenues. So it does not have to be the 1-cent sales tax or the vehicle license fee revenue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Harkey. Mr. Chesborough, followed by Ms. Buchanan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting the members of the General Budget Committee, not members of this subcommittee, to participate. As those of you that were at the LA hearing may recall, I briefly touched on the issue of the impact of realignment on rural counties, and I was very pleased with Ms. Cummins' response that there's an active engagement with the rural counties to try to identify those factors that are unique and may be, in addition to some of the other concerns raised by Mr. Nielsen and others about the general concept. Small rural counties may not have the resources or capacity to implement realignment because, first of all, operating programs in rural communities, contrary to many federal regulations and other standards, is actually more expensive because of the lower economics of scale. And so the challenge of trying to provide programs in rural counties in many ways is much greater. Many rural counties lack sufficient transportation, communication, personnel, and financial infrastructure to operate these programs. And so in order to ensure that realignment will work in rural counties, the proposal's going to need to make sure that programs retain flexibility at the local level, which is, I think, should be part of the definition of realignment if it's going to be successful. Small rural counties will need to be involved not only in these realignment discussions in constructing the realignment, but also in negotiations with the federal government for federally supported and sanctioned programs in which have been realigned. A few specific examples, there's many, but I'll just try to touch down on a few. The juvenile justice realignment, many rural counties don't have any wards or have very few currently being supervised in state custody. There are no facilities, programs, infrastructure, or personnel who can supervise the care for this very expensive population. And to the extent that these counties are able to contract back to the state to provide these services, it's obvious, should be obvious, I hope, that the amount given to the counties equals the amount that the state would charge.
And I know other options are also being considered, such as joint powers authorities or the ability of one county to contract with another, and those all need to be looked at as viable options. County supervision of low-level offenders. Many rural counties, like some of their larger counterparts, are operating under court-ordered population caps. If these small rural counties are mandated to serve low-level offenders, it could require additional capital facilities, and funds would have to be, to the extent those had to happen in the county where the offender was from, there'd have to be capital available to improve those facilities. And of course, it's very difficult from a staffing perspective. It's been increasingly difficult for small counties to recruit public safety personnel. I guess it's maybe getting difficult everywhere, but anything you can say about the difficulty in the suburbs is more true in a rural community. And especially those who are required to have certain license or certification, such as medical personnel or rehab counselors. And then with regards to adult parolees, there are a number of rural counties that have very few persons incarcerated in the state prisons awaiting parole. Under the realignment proposal, if rural counties have a new responsibility for parole supervision, a whole new infrastructure, including rehab counselors and monitors, would need to be established to manage the population. And of course, the technological infrastructure, such as GPS for monitors, may not function in a number of rural areas. So that's a brief sampling of some of the examples. I know the organizations CSAC and RCRC are bringing forward to the administration those concerns, but I want to make sure this committee is also open to and working with rural counties to ensure that whatever realignment proposal goes forward take into account the uniqueness that those small counties face. And I don't hear from them a flat-out, as we don't hear from any affected stakeholders, flat-out opposition. Obviously, there's grave concern about the how. And so I just wanted to make sure those issues are before the Budget Committee and the legislature, as well as the administration, so that we can try to hammer them out while we're dealing with the issues that will affect the much larger population of the state that lives in the suburbs and the urban areas. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time.
Do either of our witnesses wish to comment on that issue? No.
I would just say that we're certainly aware of the issues that the small and rural counties have, and in fact, in 1982 or 3, when we did the medically indigent adult transfer, there was an arrangement made with the small counties that they could contract back with the state. So we are looking at different options like that.
I'll certainly echo, as the chair of the Budget Committee, we want to make sure that we take those considerations into account and we work with the members who represent those rural counties. Next, we have Ms. Buchanan, followed by Ms. Mitchell.
Hi. We keep talking about having a way of guaranteeing revenue. I was on school board for 18 years, and we had Prop 98 was supposed to guarantee revenue, and yet we went through 5 rounds of budget cuts when I was on school board. It excludes the cuts the last 2 years. Is there any area that we fund where we have guaranteed revenue and we never have to deal with budget cuts or realities of recession?
Not to my knowledge over the last 33 years.
Yeah.
No.
I know that's a rhetorical question, but I don't know how we can make any guarantees in any budget area that we're never going to face another recession, or we're never going to, have to make cuts. I think certainly, especially given the volatility of our revenue stream, because we have one of the most volatile revenue streams in the nation. So certainly, we need to do all we can to avoid that, and to the extent we can align revenues with programs, it makes much more sense. But while I think it's a very valid point that the LAO raises, I don't know how we can guarantee that for any program.
I would just observe that I think there are 2 kinds of guarantees people are looking at. One is the nature of the ongoing nature of the revenue, and the governor is committed to that. But I think we would certainly agree that it's the legislature and the governor would like stable revenue and an ongoing commitment. And we have volatile revenue, and we will have economic recessions in the future. So you can't guarantee that. I think the important thing here, and it's We tried to deal with it a little bit in the 1991 realignment by saying things like, given the amount available or given the dollar amount available, you provide services to this population. There are ways you can deal with that, but you're never going to find a perfect match.
If I may add, it is not our office's position that you should guarantee that this line of revenues will exactly match the line of programs that are to be realigned. But it's that you should be cognizant of the long-term cost of the program, of the scope of programs that you're realigning, and the long-term revenues that are going to be provided for the program.
Right.
And it may be possible with provision of sufficient flexibility that a county might be able to administer a program at lower cost, but also to be conscious at the other side, which is, could the county's cost grow if there are future legislative actions or federal court actions? So to be conscious of the long-term cost of the program and the degree of flexibility that a county will have to be able to respond to those kinds of
I
costs.
agree wholeheartedly with you. I would just point out that, and if you go from 1970 when I graduated from college to today, where our California's population has doubled, and you take a look at what we've done to the UC budget or the Cal State budget, we're never able to do that perfectly. And I wish we had a longer-term outlook on every program we funded, because I think we would make better fiscal decisions. But just sort of to state my perspective on this, what Prop 13 did more than anything is it shifted responsibility for just about all levels of government to the state of California, because it shifted the funding there. Prior to Prop 13, schools were primarily funded about 2/3 to 3/4 of the dollars with local tax revenues. Now it's just the opposite, where most of that, the 2/3 to 3/4, comes from the state. Many of your local services got shifted to the state. And since Prop 13, our population's almost doubled. I think government services are better provided closer to the people. When you have a state of 38 million people, it's hard for me to believe that the state knows better than local counties and agencies. So I think overall the realignment is a good idea, which I think you point out even in your report. When I look at our prison population, for example, Missouri implemented a system of local youth, community-based detention systems, surrounded the kids with lots of support, and has reduced their recidivism rate from 70% to 10%. Santa Clara is copying that model and having some great results. Now, that's not to say we're going to have good results everywhere, but I do think it makes sense to allow local agencies to make the best decisions for their populations. So it seems to me that the real question has to be, how do we, what programs, as you say, make sense, and how do we implement it in a thoughtful manner so we don't put unnecessary stress on the system. My colleague, Assemblymember Chesbro, brings up some great questions about rural counties. So I would encourage you, one, to continue the dialogue. And lastly, the other question that comes up is, we have current state employees that are providing these services that potentially are going to be out of work if they're shifted. So I hope as part of your dialogue we're also talking about what happens with our labor force shift, so we're not creating problems in one area and solving them in the other. But I think ultimately there's never a good time. If we had money, we could say we don't need to do this. But I think even if we had money, I think it makes sense to have a realignment so we get services closer to the people and get them to the people who know their communities best and can make those decisions.
Thank you. Ms. Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was struck by today's LAO's report on page 6, where you kind of separate the programs that you feel are suited for realignment and those that aren't. And it struck me because I could be wrong, but I seem to recall a previous report specifically on your proposal around foster care, where the LAO recommended that foster care was not well suited for realignment. Your report that came out maybe a month ago, primarily because of the level of federal funding and federal requirements that govern the foster care world. Title 4E, all those kinds of things. And I realize today we're really talking about kind of the realignment proposal at a 10,000-foot level, should we or shouldn't we? So I don't want to dig too deeply into the details, but I was struck by kind of a different position and just wanted to understand how you came to that.
I'm not certain about the previous report that you've mentioned, but going back for a long ways in LAO tradition in terms of realignment, this program has been one that our office has supported realignment, to my mind, I think all the way back to 1993 from our original Making Government Make Sense report. This is a program that will be complex to realign it, very complex. But it is essentially part of the overall public safety arena, and we think that those services could be administered better at the local level.
My follow-up question deals more broadly with child welfare services, specifically adoption, and just wanting to understand how the non-publicly funded adoption services, the private, the independent adoptions, if they will be incorporated into the transfer to the local levels as well.
This proposal assumes all of adoptions is transferred. Okay. People have obviously raised concerns about that, so we are talking to the Department of Social Services.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. A couple questions on that same page, on page 6. For the LAO, we have a 621 of unallocated, 621 million unallocated growth. How does that compare to other programs across the board, and how did we come up with that number?
I should point out all of these numbers are directly from the governor's proposed budget in summary. And the 621 is simply showing the expected revenue growth associated with the increase in the sales tax and the vehicle license fee from 2011-12 to 2014-15. So that is simply growth in the sales tax and the vehicle license fee over that time. I don't believe there's any other dollars included in that amount, but I defer to Ms. Cummings.
No, that's what it is. We held the programs constant, so because the growth would be allocated, could be allocated differently, so we just show the total amount of the growth compared to static programs. So $621 million is available in that year to spread to programs.
In terms of other aspects of the budget that we're assuming holding most other programs constant as well, or are we assuming some minor form of growth? Obviously, the growth is related to the revenue and not to the programmatic growth. I get that.
Right.
But basically, I'm just asking how it compares up to the rest of the general fund growth, that 621 million. I mean, sales tax.
It's our sales tax estimate forecast and the vehicle license fee estimate. So it's whatever was used for the regular budget. For those two revenue sources.
Okay. If we were not using those revenue sources and we were it was part of the general fund, how fast would the general fund grow? Would it be more or less than that amount, according to your assumptions?
The revenue?
Yeah.
The revenue forecast is the revenue forecast. I mean, it doesn't change because it's a realigned revenue forecast. That the revenue would be realigned. It would be the same whether it was put into the general fund or put into realignment.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is I'm just trying to see if programmatically there would be sort of a different level of funding if these programs were in the general fund versus on a separate funding.
Perhaps another way of answering the question: these programs, under the administration's proposal, would be funded through the sales tax and vehicle license fee. So, how do those revenue sources grow versus the principal revenue sources for the state's general fund, which is the personal income tax and the bank and corp tax, and also the sales tax. Right. So it's basically a question of, over these next few years, do we think the personal income tax and bank and corp tax are going to grow faster than the sales tax and vehicle license fee? I can ask the question, but unfortunately I cannot answer it.
I actually don't know the answer either.
Okay. Let me ask you a different question on the same chart, though. basically to respond to what the LAO is saying that court security is not suited, and these other programs on the second tier are merit consideration. So sort of it opens up the natural question, well, why do you think that court security, why do you think the LAO is wrong on court security, and why do you think that they're not as right on the middle ground?
Court security is currently provided in 56 counties by the county sheriff, and that is under state statute. It is not the administration's proposal to change that arrangement, but it seems appropriate to us, given that the county is responsible for the entire sheriff's budget, that this money, which really doesn't have to do with so much the operations of the court, but the security of the court, again, local sheriffs providing the service, should go to the county for meeting the court security needs.
And on the other programs, the middle tier, or do you not have the sheet in front of you? Sort of giving you the platform to respond to the LAO, which is giving some criticism to those programs.
Well, substance abuse treatment, EPSDT, mental health managed care, and the existing community mental health services, those are all programs currently provided through the county for the state. So we think they go along with the public safety programs, and we think they're county administered now and meet the definition.
Okay. Mr. Cedillo.
Well, I was just going to add or ask if, in addition to the fact that it's currently security and it's in statute, it's being provided by local sheriffs, but by good reason. Isn't the local circumstance, the environment, the capacity, aren't all these appropriate considerations for the county? Not statewide considerations, but local considerations for the counties to negotiate with the sheriffs for that appropriate security.
Yes, each county has different arrangements regarding security.
Well, I think this question gives us a nice segue into bringing up Gene Hurst from the California State Association of Counties. And if you two wouldn't mind, I'll have you stay at the table, because maybe we'll have some questions that any one of you may want to answer, unless you have to run to another hearing. But if you have the moment, it'd be great to stay. And with that, I'd like to ask Ms. Hurst to give her presentation. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members. I'm Jean Hurst with the California State Association of Counties. My colleagues at CSAC and I have been engaging our members over the last 4 weeks, county supervisors, both rural and urban, county administrators, councils, staff, our affiliate organizations, sheriff, probation, district attorney, welfare directors, mental health directors, alcohol and drug program directors, and everybody in between, in a very lengthy dialogue about the governor's budget proposal. So I come to you with that perspective. Our leadership has made a commitment to this administration and the leadership of this body and of the Senate to attempt to work out the best way to appropriately realign programs and services from the state to counties. Of course, with the greatly constrained time frame offered by the governor. And our view really is that this proposal offers both opportunities and risks. And sort of it's our job to figure out where the appropriate opportunities are, where the risks are, and what could potentially mitigate those risks. From an opportunity perspective, we recognize that the state's in a severe fiscal crisis, and certainly there are great challenges that you all face when it comes to addressing the state's ongoing budget deficit. We do think that there could be an opportunity for greater local control and flexibility, as both Ms. Cummins and Ms. O'Malley mentioned. Counties have been very creative and innovative over the years in a number of ways, in a number of program areas, to attempt to sort of get maximum bang for the buck on public services. So we think that the governor's realignment proposal does offer an opportunity to expand that authority, provide greater incentives for flexibility, and hopefully better outcomes for the communities that we jointly serve. We like the idea of diversity among program service levels amongst our individual counties. I think the governor mentioned that the folks in Modoc County may not view the world the same as the folks in Alameda County, and he was okay with that. I can assure you that our supervisors certainly feel that that's the case and really do appreciate the approach of allowing for local priorities and local needs to sort of drive the conversation in those communities. Finally, in terms of opportunities, obviously there's some additional resources being put on the table to allow for some programs to continue in a way that perhaps they would not otherwise be able to continue given the sort of dire circumstances of the state's finances. In terms of risks, obviously there are some significant ones in terms of dealing with the governor's proposal. Our focus really has been on how to mitigate those risks. We agree there is no risk-free option in this discussion. Certainly there are challenges in moving forward in that direction. We are very concerned about the revenues. You've talked a lot about it already, but we really are looking for some ability to have a stable and dedicated revenue source that is available for counties to sort of count on to provide these types of services. The adequacy is a primary concern. As you've discussed already, for the most part in these programs, caseload tends to increase at the exact time revenues decrease. That's certainly been the experience in 1991. So what can we do to mitigate the natural ebb and flow of resources and service needs in a downward economy? Many of the programs that are being contemplated are brand new to counties. We've never done some of these things before, and so sort of getting our minds wrapped around the concept of doing something that has never been contemplated at the local level is a challenge. And it's going to require some creative thinking, I think, to move forward and sort of develop what could be a local continuum, if you will, of community correction services that both meets the needs of the community, utilizes resources appropriately, and provides for the public safety. Obviously, in the Health and Human Services side, 100% share of costs is a challenge to deal with, and you've heard that in the subcommittees before, because the state continues to have an abiding interest in the success of these programs. So how can we essentially ensure that we are partners moving forward, even though the realignment proposal considers 100% share of cost for counties in those programs? In many instances, these programs are underfunded. We have had a downturn, obviously, that's impacted the 1991 realignment funding structure. So we are sort of operating from, I guess, a little bit below the neutral line and sort of moving forward in that manner. So how are those issues being addressed? What I've shared with you today are the 2010 CSAC realignment principles. These were prepared late last summer after Senator Steinberg proposed a similar restructuring proposal. They're fairly, I think they're relevant to the conversation today and certainly have been guiding our discussions as we consider both the risks and the opportunities of the proposal. I will just make a couple of points that I think have been brought up earlier. In terms of, sort of who gets the dough, you should be aware that our position is that generally the Board of Supervisors should have expenditure authority of funds. If we're sort of tasked with creating a continuum of services and having flexibility, we want to make sure that we have fiscal control as well. There has been some talk about the option of a local authority for taxation. We don't believe that that's an appropriate revenue source for a realignment. We believe that there needs to be a statewide stable revenue source for realignment in this context. We also want to support the notion that we can't just do a realignment, lock the door, and throw away the key, that there needs to be an ability to open up the structure and revisit some issues. I think particularly with some changes in federal law that are going to be coming out, we're going to need the ability to go in and make some tweaks to the realignment proposal without the threat of blowing the whole thing up. Finally, I would just say that the allocation discussion is going to be very difficult. Obviously, folks are very interested in what level of resources they're going to receive. However, we definitely want to get the basics down first and have those discussions after we sort of have set the table. I should share with you that in 1991, counties apparently locked themselves in a room for a couple days to figure it all out, and it was a trying couple of days, but they eventually came up with a solution. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions about our process or how we're sort of viewing things. I do want to commit to you that while there's a great deal of anxiety and uncertainty about moving forward, particularly in the constrained time frame, we are committed to providing as much information as we can to both the administration and to you to help craft a reasonable and workable proposal that hopefully will result in better outcomes at the community level. Thank you.
A couple things to start. You mentioned the principles of and how they apply, and I'm trying to put that lens on all the programs that I see on page 6. If you are those principles articulatable at this point to be able to say that there's like 1 or 2, 3 programs that you really think will be great for the counties, and a couple of them that you really think are going to be a big problem? And if so, can you outline specifically which ones?
In terms of the programs, Mr. Chair, I would say that we have not said no to anything. There are risks involved in all of them, and what we're attempting to work out is appropriate flexibilities and mitigations that could apply to all of these programs. I think that the stakeholders involved in each of these have been very active in our discussions and have provided us with some good information. We're very hopeful to be able to share sort of detailed analysis on each program, hopefully this week.
Another question. You sort of raised the issue about, I guess it's sort of, you're raising the question, why are we doing 100% realignment and not just adjusting the ratios? It's an interesting question. I wanted to have Ms. Cummings address that question and maybe have a little dialogue about that, because that is a question that's out there with a lot of, that you've raised, but I've heard before. So maybe we could have a little dialogue on that.
I don't believe that it's our view that the state has to have a share of costs to have an interest in the program. The state is interested in these programs, and the state, what is the state's role in terms of the programs? If you take a look at child welfare services, for instance, these are wards of the state, not wards of the county. So the state would obviously have an interest. If we were the single state agency, for the federal government, we would have that interest, and it is the state that is required, for example, in that program to monitor outcomes. So I do think in some of these programs there's more of a relationship than people may think. I think what's happened is that those lines have blurred, and if you clearly define what the state's role is, the state can have an interest without necessarily having a share of cost. I would like to point out, however, that we have certainly heard the counties and the concern that has been expressed about what about federal law changes, what about court settlements, what about new statutory provisions that cost money, and that is something that we are talking about internally, because those are risks outside of what's the general revenue for the program type of risk, and I think that's a fair question.
And so then I'm going to turn that question back on Ms. Hurst. You just heard her response. And why can't the state have an interest that doesn't have to be a ratio-based interest, but can just be an interest because we're the state.
Sure, Mr. Chair. I think what we've talked about is then what is an appropriate role for the state and counties, being that the state will be the single state agency that the federal government wants to deal with. So how do counties have a role in negotiations that the state will have with the federal government, or negotiations that come up in the courts? We would like that to be formalized. We would like to make sure that the state and counties are a partner in that conversation. We'd also like to make sure that the search for additional federal dollars is pursued with vigor. And so those are the kinds of things that we would want sort of alliterated when we talk about moving these programs to the counties directly.
Okay, Ms. Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as I was listening to you, Ms. Cummings, in terms of the laundry list of kind of the unknowns out there in the universe, it also occurred to me, particularly with regard to child welfare services, that there may be some programs also that have been underfunded or have been cut to date, and services have been reduced and compromised. And so recognizing that counties may be in a position where we're now asking them to provide services to a caseload that will grow, but kind of the funding base today isn't adequate. And so that would be another concern in terms of how we develop a formula that will continue to be helpful and relevant over time.
Absolutely.
Okay, next will be Mr. Gordon, followed by Ms. Bonilla. Mr. Gordon.
Thank you. Ms. Hurst, thank you for being here and having recently arrived to this role from serving for 13 years as a county supervisor. And I want to, first of all, thank CSAC and the members of County Board of Supervisors across the state for being open to this discussion. I do think that there is a real value in moving these services, many of these services, down to delivery at the local level. And I would encourage, as discussions occur between finance, the LAO, CSAC, that we look at how we establish a set of statewide outcome measures that will set the parameter for what we want to have delivered, but give the counties the maximum level of flexibility to meet those outcomes, so that services can be designed in a way that truly meet the variety that exists and the diversity that exists in the 58 counties in this state. I also think that there are many parts of the realignment principles that CSAC developed that we ought to be keeping in mind, and that includes how this ongoing relationship between the state and the counties will function, and particularly as it would relate to the issue that was recently discussed around the state being the point of contact for federal programs. We need to make sure that there is built into this work a good, solid mechanism for communication and involvement of the counties. And finally, I do think that there is also a way that we design these programs correctly as we realign. For the state to have an adequate level of monitoring without an over level of monitoring. It certainly was my experience as a county supervisor that there were far too many widgets counted by the auditors that came from the various state agencies, and not enough attention sometimes paid to the outcomes. And I think we really need to focus here on getting the results for these dollars, and not necessarily on whether every single widget was counted in the delivery of the program. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Great. Ms. Bonilla, followed by Mr. Nielsen.
Thank you very much for being here today in your report, and I would echo and agree with many of the comments that Assemblymember Gordon just made, and also as a former county supervisor until a few months ago, I share a lot of his perspective. I think that many folks don't understand the role and the job, the excellent job that many counties have been performing over these many years, and I think counties are better suited in many ways. They're able to develop community partnerships They're better able to have higher levels of accountability, transparency, and really quality control when given the opportunities to do that. I think they understand the communities in which they're situated and therefore the service focus and emphasis that needs to happen when we talk about being innovative and talk about the needs for earlier interventions to avoid some of the down-the-road costs. Counties can be very well positioned to actually see and understand what those targeted interventions need to be, how to allocate funding in a way that isn't always at the back end and the crisis, but sometimes at the front end, and achieving the goal of really helping the community more effectively avoid some of the crisis outcomes. I think that the counties understand the whole concept of the return on investment and the social return on investment, that for this money, these tax dollars that are invested into the community, what can we then receive back as a community for doing a really good job for averting some of the higher cost situations. So I think counties really do get it. I have some concerns. We're doing this in an environment that's been mentioned. It's cuts upon cuts. We're at the same time that we're considering this, we're already it's front-loaded with some extra cuts. Okay, so there's going to be a bonus here for the counties of things they're going to have to cut even before, and this is after cutting millions and millions of dollars in the last few years at the county level. So I am concerned about these layered impacts upon very fragile programs right now. We've already been trying to manage at the county level, trying to avoid complete elimination, talking about we want to keep something in place so it can come back someday. So I have a concern about that. And then transition funding. I think that is very, very critical. This is not going to happen without a tremendous amount of effort, thoughtfulness, staff time, to think that the counties are going to have resources to really pull off this kind of transition without any funding for that is I think, going to be challenging and going to hamper some of the excellent outcomes that we are saying we're committed to. So it isn't just like, let's give transition funding because the counties are demanding it. But no, if we're really committed to greater outcomes, then I think we know that when we put the resources there, we're going to get a better end product. I think a lot of our discussion around realignment, and this has been touched on, is really we're dealing with some symptoms here that have been around for a long time. And I guess I hope, maybe this is idealism of a newcomer, that as we're dealing with what are we going to do with the budget situation, what's the best way to handle the situation we're in, that we're going to look at some of the underlying causes here as well. We've talked about volatile revenue streams. At some point, that needs to be addressed for all of our programs. We need to look at ways to stabilize that. And we need to be very committed, and I believe the counties want to hear this from the state level, around the issue of job creation. Frankly, we know our unemployment rate is what's just hurting us at every level right now. And I think the counties are willing to say, we'll do the job we can do well. We know we can do it. We'll do this service delivery. But look back at the state and say, where's your commitment to really trying to put a lot of energy into job creation and seeing that as a way to long-range stabilize the economy here in California, because that's how we're all going to end up being successful. It isn't moving something from here to here. It's about seeing our revenues rebound, our jobs rebound, our education program come back to full strength. And so I think it would be fair for the counties to have that expectation upon us here at the state level to be committed and to state that commitment to the long-term health, and particularly around the issue of job creation. And then also we talked about this cycle that we get into where when there's the least amount of revenue, there's the highest demand. More people out of work, more children in need, more health needs, people off of insurance. And that's a very critical issue. And I think that we also need, as part of our longer range planning, talk about how we're going to deal with that. Is there going to be some kind of commitment to reserves at the state level that says, we understand that we've been in this cycle over and over again, and we want to do some long-range planning because we've learned our lesson, and we want to be able to be there on behalf of our constituency and the counties to say we're not going to just leave you holding the bag out there 10, 15, 20 years from now. We're going to join you in a commitment using our resources to do that kind of long-range planning for security for the future. So thank you for your comments. It's a big task ahead of us. But again, I think that having the discussion is very worthwhile, and I hope the outcome is going to be better service delivery long-term here in the state for the people who really do rely so much upon all of these services and on the public safety guarantees that they come to rely upon in each and every community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nielsen.
Ms. Hurst, I appreciate CSAC trying to be engaged and involved, but I trust that you're much better informed about the specifics of much of this than we are. Hence, you've come to us with a list of principles, not hard points and, yeah, we like this, no, we don't like that. In my count, it's a little bit under a dozen and a half principles in here. As I read them and as I understand the proposal, I don't see a single one that I could say unequivocally of your principles are met in this proposal. Do you see any that you could really grab onto and say, yes, we can start working on this one and move to the next one? Are there any in here that are really to your satisfaction at this point?
Mr. Nielsen, that's what we've been focused on for the last 4 weeks. We've attempted to use the principles to guide our conversations about the governor's proposal. You're right, we don't have any more specifics than you do today, but we are thinking about what we could suggest or request as mitigations and flexibilities that could help align those realignment proposals more toward our principles. That's been sort of our overarching task. We're certainly looking at the constitutional amendment piece and what kinds of protections we would like to see in that measure, both on the revenue side and on sort of the future side, as well as a programmatic, program by program, detail by detail analysis based on the principles that we previously adopted. It's taken a long time to get there. We're very close to a draft. Hopefully this week we'll have that available to you for your review.
Well, we really don't have a lot of time. We may be voting on a budget as early as Friday that would go to conference, but I mean, we're putting up votes on something immediately. And then conference won't last very long, and then we'll be out of conference. I'd suggest that we're on a very compacted timeline for something as monumental as this. And not even spoken to here, and it's an area where we don't find any comfort, that so-called phase 2 of this would be acceding to the county's greater ability to take tax votes before their local taxpayers to fund some of these programs. And that's something that's also very worrisome. Have CSAC given any consideration to that authority to tax more at the local level of your own citizens?
We have, Mr. Nielsen. We don't believe that local taxing authority, the ability of counties to go to the voters and ask for more tax revenue, is an appropriate revenue source for realigned programs. Generally, they are statewide in nature. We know that it's very unlikely that we could raise revenue on a county-by-county basis on the statewide basis. In some counties, we couldn't raise enough money to fund many of these programs. So we don't believe that it's an appropriate revenue source for realignment. That said, County CSAC has generally taken the position that county boards of supervisors should have the authority to raise taxes locally. That's a general sort of supportive principle, but for realignment purposes, we do not think that local taxing authority is an appropriate revenue source.
Well, my experience is when you control things at your level and they can see that police department being built, those potholes being filled with a time-certain tax imposed on them, then local taxpayers are more disposed to do that. But this more nebulous thing with all of the state stuff, I found our citizens to be very skeptical. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
It's not the administration's proposal to have local taxes raised for realignment. This would be a statewide tax. The governor has talked about a proposal relative to economic development, but it's not related to realignment.
Thank you for clarifying that. Any additional questions from the members? If not, I'd like to move to public testimony. And thank you, all the witnesses, thank you very much for your time and very good comments. So if we could just line up at the microphone. We're more or less 2 minutes, but I think we've got a small group, so we'll be flexible. Go ahead, please. Is the microphone on? I don't. Technical difficulties, but
good afternoon. Craig Brentford, California Correctional Peace Officers Association. We want to say we're again not opposed to any of this. We want to engage in the conversation, have a discussion. I think the first thing we want to point out though is this whole discussion about lower level offenders. 80% of convicted felons are retained by local government. Only the top 20% of convicted felons come to the state. So when you describe lower level offenders, that's like saying to your student who's in the, achieved the top 20% of their class, pretty good for a lower level student. These are not lower level offenders. They're career repeat felons. They may not do serious and violent stuff, but they are making numerous trips through the criminal justice system. We want to say this. In his press conference, the governor said he wanted to get rid of sending people to prison for 90 days or less. We completely support that principle. There's 47,000 of them a year that churn through. Most of them parole violators. It's too expensive bringing people to prison for 90 days, giving them a full medical, psychiatric, educational, and other workup. Just don't bring them if they're going to do 90 days or less. On the issue of juvenile justice, yes, you've successfully realigned many of those programs. Juvenile justice gets 3 out of 1,000 young people who are wards of the state, by the way, coming through the juvenile justice system. These are people who, if you put them back in the local programs, are going to destroy those local programs that are successful. You need to retain these people. They're mentally ill. Almost all of them have severe substance abuse problems. They're going to tear up local programs. You don't want them to do that. You're going to hurt what you've got going. We think there's an appropriate role for the state in juvenile justice. Parole realignment. We have approximately 100 parole offices throughout the state. They're as local as you can be. They know the local programs. If you go back and visit your local parole offices, and some of you probably have more than one, and talk to those people, you're going to find out they've been living in your community 20, 30 years. They know all the local resources. They do a heck of a good job dealing with these offenders who come out of the prison system. In Sacramento County, for example, 4% of adult probationers are supervised. For the inmates who are paroled to corrections and actually put on a caseload, which is all but the NRPs you created last year, 100% of them are supervised. Parolees get attention at the state level. If the counties end up having to revoke parole, they're going to end up with an intensive court-supervised revocation process. It's going to increase state costs. We think the state's better served by retaining parole at the local level, or at the state level, not the local level. That we think there's appropriate adjustments to make in parole, like shortening periods, changing how people get off parole, that can save real dollars as opposed to simply transferring costs to another level of government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Next witness.
I'm Doug Johnson with the California Alliance of Child and Family Services. We represent 120 agencies statewide that serve children and families. I wanted to make 3 points. First, on AB 3632, we strongly oppose moving that program back to education. I will remind you that before the mid-1980s, that was the responsibility of education. They failed to meet the mandate. There was a court suit, and that's how we ended up with the system we have today. The current system works extremely well with one problem, and that is the failure of the state to meet the cost of local county mental health departments for the services they provide as a state mandate. The only thing we need to do is have the state step up and make those payments on a timely manner so that counties can trust that they will get those payments that they deserve in fulfilling a federal and state mandate. With regard to the realignment of the mental health programs, I want to echo something that was already brought up to today's hearing, and that is with the upcoming federal health care reform, it seems to us just very short-sighted to be separating physical and mental health funding. It seems like those programs should be kept together at the state level. And most importantly, I want to talk about the children's entitlement programs, both in mental health, which are AB 3632 and EPSTT, and in the child welfare area. As federal entitlements, there is no additional flexibility that counties are going to get through realignment. We just don't think they're good candidates for realignment. An analysis of child welfare regulations done by the state in the early 2000s showed that 95% of the child welfare regulations came directly out of federal regulations. So we're real concerned about what is to be gained by realigning programs where there's already a significant county share of costs and probably no additional outcomes to be gained. I should also remind you that there are already extensive federal and state outcome measures for the child welfare programs. And they've been making good progress in reducing caseload. Since 2003, the overall foster care caseload has been reduced by about 39%, and the group home caseload, which is the most expensive, by 43%. So these aren't programs that are problematic, that have higher and fast-growing state costs. They're programs that the federal government, the state, the counties, and the private nonprofit sector are working well. If, however, you decide to realign those programs, we think two things are critical. And one of them is that they have to be adequately funded to reflect their true costs. These programs have been underfunded for a long time, and if that underfunding is part of realignment, that just means you guarantee underfunding at the local level. And this gets me to my final point, which is if you're going to realign, you have to provide protections for the children's programs. You've seen the full range of programs that are proposed for realignment. These include adult mental health and adult criminal justice programs. We're extremely concerned that with inadequate funding, local supervisors are going to be forced to look to the immediate threat that adults pose to them, and that the prevention programs, and that's what children's programs are, they're prevention programs or investments in the future, that funding for those programs will not be provided in full despite the fact that they're entitlements, and then will simply lead to a cycle of, frankly, additional adult problems and probably additional federal lawsuits. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Next speaker.
Good afternoon. Pamela Gibbs, representing the Los Angeles County Office of Education. As you know, the County Offices of Education provide educational services to those youth, the wards at the juvenile court schools in the juvenile halls and camps. We want to align ourselves with the comments that Ms. Hurst made. We do support many of the shifts that are occurring because this is not a new shift. This is something that's been going on for 10 years as far as the DJJ realignment. We also want to repeat the comments that Ms. Hurst made regarding adequacy. We think it's important that the kids at the juvenile court schools receive the same level of funding or adequate funding that was received at DJJ. Some reason there is a huge disparity between the two. We know that the shift has occurred for some time and we've been impacted heavily. We want to provide the same level of service. These children deserve an opportunity to keep them from going to state prison, and that's our goal. Education reduces recidivism. We think we can do that. We've been providing the services, so we need your assistance where there are savings. This is not a new cost to the state. This is within existing funds to shift some of those savings to these kids at the county facilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next speaker.
Randy Hicks of California's Disability Rights. I'm also a client of mental health services. This concerns me about the realignment program because what's happening is now in the county of Sacramento, they have closed drop-in centers and they've closed treatment centers And thanks to some budget actions that have happened, people are not getting treated. They're going to the hospital and in an emergency room. This which is also being paid for by the county. What I'm concerned about is if we realign everything and send it back down to the counties, send it down with the adequate funding, because right now they're cutting administration to service out those programs. As a client, I've known I have not been able to get treatment, or I had gone into a hospital to get treatment through Medi-Cal. So that's what I'm concerned about. If you're going to give them more responsibility, you've got to give them more money, because otherwise you're going to be working more, doing more with less, and with less people to handle the costs, because they're already laying off county staff as it is.
Thank you very much. Next speaker.
Hi, Cindy Hillary, Regional Council of Rural Counties. I would also like to echo the comments of my colleague Jean Hurst from CSAC. We're not here to say no. We're here to say make sure you think of us. Rural counties in particular are going to be hit extremely hard with some of these proposed realignments. One size does not fit all. One just sort of an anecdotal story about the realignment of all adult parole. Think for a moment of a county that is many, many hundreds of square miles. They might have 3 sheriff's officers and maybe 2 probation officers on staff, and now they are going to be expected to do 24-hour active GPS monitoring of sex offenders. In many of these counties, the terrain is so rugged that the GPS monitors don't even function. So that's one small example of one size does not fit all. We do want to work with the legislature and with the administration to come up with solutions that can fit us, but make sure that you make sure that our thoughts are brought to the table. And a letter was provided to all members of the legislature detailing some of the other rural county concerns a couple of weeks ago. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next and final speaker.
Yeah, John Kern with SEIU 1000 and a 25-year educator in the prison system, representing a lot of the educators in both the adult and the juvenile side. First of all, we want to say we don't envy you your task. We want to appreciate the comments, particularly of members Nielsen and Buchanan, recognizing the difficulties and the lack of specificity and the pitfalls that loom in realignment. We are somewhat self-interested, but we are also interested in good public policy. Those of us that dedicate our lives every day to trying to reduce this recidivism and this permanent incarceration that we seem to engage in this state would love nothing more than to be put out of business. We would not be like to put out of business by simply shifting the people and the problems somewhere else. Some of us, I suppose, will follow the work and end up working for county agencies, but we're not convinced that the outcomes will really be better unless some miracle happens. The idea that transition costs are significant, very important to point out, at the very moment when we're most lacking in resources to consider such a major reorganization of public services that are already kind of at the breaking point, whether they're at the local level or the state level, seems something that should give you all a great pause. Regarding the Division of Juvenile Justice and whether it should exist or not, it's a wonderful fiction to believe that these are children and that they need to have certain kinds of special support in order to thrive, and that somehow by moving the problem locally that they will miraculously be cured. It has been pointed out, as Member Nielsen did so well, these are the worst of the worst. These are the double and triple diagnosis failures of any number of attempts to be reached. I'm sure there are exceptions buried in the population somewhere that should be local, but if DJJ goes out of business, there will be quite a difficult problem on the hands of local probation and local juvenile hall administrators. And the other half, I should say, of the DJJ population will go directly to prison. And from thenceforward, you'll have no middle ground, no middle solution. You'll have one or the other for every juvenile offender. It should be pointed out once again that probably about half of 1% of the juvenile arrests in the state end up in the DJJ facilities currently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, members. I mean, I won't make a lot of closing remarks. I'll just say that trying to get this kind of change
is clearly a complicated process and one that we're going to work toward. And we have a vote coming up on Friday of this week, but that is obviously a major milestone point. But then we'll be working through the conference committee process as well. And this is a process, and we need to all work together and take into consideration all of the concerns that we've heard today, of which there are many, and which they're serious. So thank you all very much for participating in the hearing, and this hearing is over.